Okay, moving on to sections 3 and 4, evolution of the nervous system. The first brain cells evolved around 700,000 million years ago, which is a very long time ago. And the first brain, which is like a connection of brain cells, evolved around 250 million years ago. The modern human brain, as we know it, is relatively young, only 200,000 years old. Within the five kingdoms of organisms that you might remember from biology classes, only animals have nervous systems and muscles. So when we talk about the nervous system, we're talking only about animals. The simplest and earliest form of the nervous system was called the nerve net, and there are very simple organisms that still exist today that have a nerve net, which is essentially just throughout the body a kind of loose connection of nerve cells. So no centralized brain, just this sort of net of neurons throughout the body. And over time, nervous systems became increasingly more organized, complex, maybe localized, culminating with the modern human brain, which is the most complex nervous system. Humans are primates, and we evolved from the same ancestors as other apes that still exist. So we didn't necessarily evolve from apes that are existing, but we have common ancestors. In general, brain size is in proportion to body size increases with intelligence. So the bigger the proportion of your brain in relative to your body, the more intelligent as an organism. This isn't necessarily for people, but for species in general. Primates in general have good color vision. We're good at distinguishing color. We can see red and green distinctions, most of us can at least. We have forward-facing eyes that allow for depth perception and strong vision, so the visual system is particularly evolved to be strong in primates. The earliest remains from our genus, from the human genus Homo, were found in Ethiopia. And here's a picture of some of the earliest human remains. This is a jawbone at the bottom here. As the ancestors of humans evolved, brain size increased, particularly the size of the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is this, literally the lobe that's in the front part of your brain, and it's associated with the most complex functions, executive functions we call them. So intelligence in humans is associated with the fact that our frontal lobe is bigger than a lot of other primates. And as our frontal lobes increased, the complexity of tools that we used also increased based on anthropological and archaeological findings. And so we can assume that as the frontal lobe increased, humans became more intelligent based on this kind of proxy measure of how complex the tools were that they were using. Modern humans, us, were Homo sapiens sapiens, appearing 200,000 years ago, which is relatively young in terms of the scale of how long animals and living organisms have been around. Neanderthals existed alongside modern humans and died out probably only 40,000 years ago. So there was quite a bit of time that Neanderthals and modern humans were existing side by side. There used to be kind of the belief that Neanderthals were really, really basic and not that intelligent or complex, but actually there's more and more indication that they were relatively complex and had like culture and language, religious beliefs. And there's actually some interesting findings that they had brain sizes that were the same or maybe even slightly larger than modern humans. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were more intelligent than modern humans, but it's just kind of interesting that they at least had comparable brain sizes. So the brain size ratio that I talked about before, the proportion, is called the encephalization quotient, which is the ratio of actual brain size to expected brain size based on the body of a given animal. So if you look at the graph on the right, there's this regression line which is what you would expect the brain size of an animal to be based on its body size. So a dog and a raccoon, these are pretty close to what you would expect, kind of an average encephalization quotient. The farther above the trend line an animal falls, the more intelligent it tends to be. So you see monkeys and Homo sapiens there, they tend to be a little more intelligent. And the farther below the trend line an animal falls, the less intelligent it tends to be. So rhinos, kind of dumb, moles, I guess pretty dumb for their body size. But this is a really rough estimate. This ratio is a really rough estimate, and so it's not the whole picture. There's also, excuse me, density of brain cells, density of neurons that have to be taken into account. So your brain could be, you could have two brains that were the same size, but one of them is denser and is packed with more neurons, and the denser brain would be associated with higher level of intelligence. So why did the humanoid brain get so large and densely packed? There are, obviously we don't know for sure, but there are a number of ideas. One could be a response to changing climates in East Africa. So the out of Africa theory is that modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, and even some versions before this, Homo erectus and Neanderthals, were originally in East Africa, so in this area around Ethiopia and Kenya. There's this big valley in that region where a lot of the oldest specimens of humans are found. And it's believed that changes in climate caused the first modern humans to leave Africa, and so they had to adapt to this changing environment that they were leaving. There are also evidence, like the larger the social group gets, the more cognitively complex an organism needs to be to keep track of all these social connections. And then a hunter-gatherer lifestyle is actually conducive to, or was conducive to, increasing in intelligence. You have to be able to remember, if you're a hunter, you have to be able to plan and problem solve and outsmart your prey. And if you're a gatherer, you have to remember where things are. You have to be able to identify different plants, figure out what's poisonous and what is not. And so a lot of these lifestyles may have selected for more intelligent Homo species. As well, it's believed that the discovery of fire and therefore the cooking of food might have made it possible to save food longer, allowing for greater caloric intake with less time devoted to finding food. So if you cook meat, it can stay longer, it can keep longer. As well, you don't have to spend as much time. Cooked food tends to be more easily digested, so you're not spending as much energy digesting food. And then less mastication or chewing. If your food is cooked, you don't have to chew as much, which allows for smaller jawbones, which allows for more room for the skull to grow, which might seem kind of far-fetched, but there's some indication that the more intelligent Homos became, the smaller the jaw size was. Changes in the skull shape also appears to allow for more blood flow to the brain. So there's something called neoteny, which is juvenile characteristics that are retained into adulthood that allow for greater periods of learning and development. So the idea with neoteny is that the longer an organism has its young in juvenile periods, kind of the more development can happen. So for humans, we have a really long developmental period. I mean, we're not considered adults until we're 18 years old, whereas a giraffe is born pretty much able to stand within a few minutes, immediately able to run away from prey. So this kind of prolonged period where someone is taking care of us when we're young allows for more cognitive functions and more complex learning and development. Kind of a sort of a version of neoteny, or maybe in contrast to neoteny, some people believe that we go through each stage of development, but these stages are just prolonged relative to other apes. So neoteny is more that that more intelligent species never go through these later developmental stages, and a contrasting viewpoint to that is that we do go through these stages, but they're just longer. Okay, so section 5, the modern human brain. So the question is, does size matter? So does the size of a brain of an individual matter? And the answer appears to be sometimes it matters, but not always. So larger brains are associated with higher IQs if a person's brain, for developmental reasons, is really, really small. So there are certain developmental disorders that retard the growth of the brain, and this is associated with a lower IQ. However, men, as compared to women, and larger people, just physically larger people, tend to also have larger brains, but this is not necessarily correlated with higher IQs. So there are some caveats to an association between brain size and intelligence in individuals. However, there are some factors that influence, some kind of like third factors that may influence an association between body size and IQ, like good nutrition. So if somebody has good nutrition, they're probably going to be taller, they're probably going to be larger, and they're probably going to have a higher IQ as well. Intelligence is also a really complicated construct. We have intelligence tests, but they're culturally biased, and they only measure one form of intelligence, pretty much. They measure cognitive functions, but they don't measure emotional intelligence. They don't measure. Some people would argue that athletic ability is a form of intelligence, like being able to perform complex motor skills is a form of intelligence. So the question of whether brain size correlates with intelligence can be kind of complicated. One really important aspect of the modern human brain is that it's plastic. Plasticity means a potential for change, chemical and physical change. So when you learn things, anytime you learn things, your brain is changing in structure, and this is plasticity. It's the ability of the brain to change in structure and function to adapt to the environment. And we will talk a bit more about brain plasticity in a later chapter as well. Compared to some other species, the modern human brain evolved relatively rapidly, and increasing complexity of the brain was associated with increasing complexity in culture. So just like how we saw increased area of the frontal lobe being associated with increased complexity in tools, we also see bigger brain, bigger frontal lobes, more complexity of the brain being associated with more complex culture. Culture being the learned behaviors and beliefs that are passed down from generation to generation. And there are indications of culture or some kind of like recording of daily life as early as like almost 40,000 years ago. So there are cave drawings in Indonesia, which is the oldest known figurative art, and this is as old as 35,000 years ago. This pig deer is about 35,000 years old, and there's a hand that appears to be about 40,000 years old. So the takeaway of this chapter in general is that the modern human brain is rather special. It's the most complex organ that we have. The human brain is the most complex out of any organism, and there's still a lot that we don't know about it. There's still a lot to be learned.